when you were a kid at school, did you ever get called into the principal's office? Jay?
I'd rather not remember.
Okay. Well, I did. More than once, I think. It was scary. You never know. Why? All you know is that the thing came over, the voice of authority came over the speaker in the classroom. Could you send Lynn to the office, please? You're like, what? You rack your memory as you slowly go down the hallway. What did I do that is so bad I get called to the principal's office? Well, what a relief it is to get there and find out it's something good, like my dad taking me out for lunch. Whew. Could you do it another way? I think Peter must have been in a situation like that. I mean, think about it. The centurion in the capital city, Caesarea was the capital city of Judea, of the province of Judea. The centurion sends his personal slaves and a soldier to come and fetch him. What did he do? Well, maybe it helped a little to know that this centurion was well respected by the Jewish community. But what kind of message does a Gentile want from him? Well, Peter had recently been called to heal Aeneas, and he did that, and then he stayed in the house of the tanner. So maybe the centurion, like Jesus healed the slave of a centurion, maybe that's what he wanted. He didn't know. But what God had in mind for Peter was far more pivotal. We read our part of the story today. It's cut up on all kinds of bits because it's a long story. Today's part is Acts 10, 23 to 35. Here's what it says. The next day, Peter got up and set out with them, and with some of the brothers from Joppa who went with him. The following day he entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him, prostrated himself at his feet, and reverenced him. I changed the wording based on commentaries. But Peter helped him up and said, "Stand up, I myself am also a man." While talking with him, he went on in and found that many had come together there. Peter said to them, it's forbidden for a Jewish man to associate or visit a foreigner. But God has shown me that I must not call any person common or unclean. That's why I came without any objection when I was sent for. So I ask, why did you send for me? Cornelius replied, 4 days ago at this hour at 3 p.m, I was praying in my house. Just then, a man in a dazzling robe stood before me and said, "Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your acts of charity have been remembered in God's sight. Therefore, send someone to Joppa and invite Simon here, who is also named Peter. He is lodging in Simon the tanner's house by the sea. Therefore, I immediately sent for you, and you did the right thing in coming. So we are all present before God to hear everything you have been commanded by the Lord." And then Peter began to speak. "Now, I really understand that God doesn't show favoritism, but in every nation, the person who fears him and does righteousness is acceptable to him." Okay. It probably took something like 4 days from the time the centurion's servants left to the time they came back with Peter. So the centurion knew about the time that Peter and his entourage would arrive. So he knew to gather everyone and to tell them when it would be. So he gathered his relatives and his best friends, which tells us also the centurion had lived in this town for a long time because he had his relatives there. Maybe he even grew up in Caesarea. Who knows? Well, all these people were at the house, and they waited. And they waited. And they waited. And he fed them. And he fed them. Because they didn't know exactly when they'd arrive, right? If you've ever been in a third world country, you know that you wait and you wait and you wait. That's how it is. Nobody had cell phones. What if Peter didn't come? They didn't even know if he was on his way, right? No telephones. The centurion would be disgraced before his relatives and friends if Peter refused to come. This was a sheer act of faith on his part to call all these people together into his house. But on the fourth day, I think a messenger on horseback probably did ride up to tell him that the people had entered the city. Peter was here now. Cornelius and his guests were ready. This shows the kind of man Cornelius was. He wanted to share this blessing with all these other people, and so he called them together. He was a witness before he even knew what he was witnessing. He's that kind of guy. He had no idea what Peter was going to tell him. He just knew an angel had told him to send for Peter. So he did. This message must be important. It might even be exciting. Who knows what this thing is? But imagine Peter's house. But imagine Peter's surprise when they entered the gate of the centurion's house, and the centurion, instead of sending a servant out to bring him in, came out himself and fell on his face to the ground. That's what it means. That's what he did. He prostrated himself in the dirt in front of Peter. Who did he think Peter was? Well, somebody important, obviously. Might even be an angel of higher rank than the angel who came to him. Who knows who this person is? I mean, you know, the whole Greek-Roman religion has gods pretending to be humans, right? That's all mixed in his head. Here's Peter. But a Jew would only bow like that to God. So Peter was shocked. This is blasphemous. So he tells him, "Get up, man. I'm not a god. I'm just a man like you." And then they walk together towards the door of the house. Now is the time of decision for Peter. Or perhaps he'd already made his decision by walking through the gate. This visit is going to cost him. It'd make him unclean. He couldn't go to synagogue or the temple for a while because he was visiting a Gentile house. And the problem is, you never know what these people have in their houses. There's even rumors that they bury children who that didn't what's the word? Babies that don't make it. Stillborn, right? That they bury the stillborn in the dirt of the house floor. Who knows what Gentiles do? And so the whole house is unclean. They don't know what they're doing in there. So the Jews say, don't even go there. And yet Peter has walking now towards the door. It was taboo for him to enter. That's what the word means. Well, of course, he'd already made himself unclean by staying in the house of the tanner with all those dead animals. So Peter was already there, I guess. What a surprise when he walked in the door. The place is full of Gentiles. Full of Gentiles. And they're waiting for him. It's like a surprise party. Surprise! Gentiles! Clearly, God had not arranged for a nice private message to the centurion. Peter had been called to preach to a house full of Gentiles. And not all of them were God-fearers either. I doubt it. So look at what Peter says to them all. It's in verse 28. He says, "You know it's forbidden for a Jewish man to associate or visit a foreigner, but God has shown me I must not call a person common or unclean." We don't really know what that meant. The Gentiles had been called unacceptable to God, condemned by God, according to the Jews. Peter had just said they're acceptable to God. He had just called them clean. That's huge. What a joyful thought was in their heart. We are acceptable to God. Some Jews had even called them dogs. And the Gentiles had thought that Jews hated all humanity. And this one statement reconciled them. What a huge leap this was for all of them. And it's the major reason why Luke, the author of Acts, puts this story in there and spends so much time on it. Listen, Luke was a Gentile. And he probably was a God-fearer himself before he became a believer in Jesus. This story is close to Luke's heart. He reveals how, this is what he's going to do in the book of Acts. And here's where he's starting. He's revealing how the gospel of Jesus Christ penetrates all the way into the capital of Rome and even into the household of Caesar. That's where he's going with this book. And this is where he starts it. Process. Well, one thing is certain to all of these people. God has called them together. Of course, Peter knew about these dual visions. The one that he got of all the unclean animals and the sheet coming down and God telling him to eat these things. And Peter refused 3 times, but he knew what the message was. That nothing is unclean, that God has made clean. And he knew about the centurion's visit by the angel, so he knew this was a dual vision. Everyone in the group in the house there knew it was a dual vision. The people in the house, though, didn't know Peter's vision. They're all holding their breath in anticipation of what he was going to say. What was this message from God that an angel had given him? Peter was about to reveal an important, critical, pivotal message to this household full of Gentiles. Up to this time, it had only spread to the Jews. So this whole idea was incomprehensible to Peter. It never occurred to him that God would begin to accept Gentiles. It was unthinkable to a Jew. Yes, Philip had brought the gospel to the Samaritans, but they were kind of Jewish. And he'd talked to an African man, but that man had been a proselyte to Judaism, so he was a Jew. And then Philip had gone up the coast preaching the gospel only to Jewish communities, all the way up into probably Caesarea, where the tradition has it that he lives now, in Caesarea. Always to Jewish communities. So Peter can't imagine what these Gentiles could possibly want to hear from him. Well, then the centurion explains why he sent for Peter, probably repeating what they all knew already, because we've just heard it. But Luke, the author, wants to emphasize this story, so he repeats it twice, maybe even 3 times. I haven't looked. This was an act of God, this meeting. Then, with all the eyes on him, looking at Peter expectantly, the centurion says, "So, we are all present before God to hear everything you have commanded us." Sound of crickets. Peter's looking at them. They're looking back at him. And he's going, what am I supposed to say? Well, the clue is in the centurion's statement. He said they had all gathered before God. This was a worship service. That's the worship language. This is a worship service in his house. So Peter now understood what God wanted him to say. He wanted to lead these people to worship God according to Jesus Christ and the kingdom of heaven. So then Peter begins to speak. Now I really understand that God doesn't show favoritism, but in every nation, the person who fears him and does righteousness is acceptable to God. Peter gets it. The kingdom of heaven is open to everyone, regardless of nationality, race, or anything else that separates people. But notice something. Look at that verse 35 again. In every nation, the person who fears him and does righteousness is acceptable to him. What does that mean? There's two criteria there. Did you see it? This is criteria for being acceptable to God. It's criteria probably for even understanding the message that Peter's going to give them. They fear God and they do righteousness. They've been living as godly people already, doing righteousness. That is such an ambiguous word. What does it mean? Righteousness? Doing righteousness? Well, it's doing right. But even that. Well, Peter's using traditional Old Testament language here to describe what a godly person is. Such a person is what Micah 6:8 tells him. Mankind has told you what is good and what the Lord requires of you. To act justly, to love faithfulness, to walk humbly with your God. That's what righteousness is. To act justly, to love faithfulness, to walk humbly with your God. It's the Ten Commandments rolled up. Well, the last half of them anyway. You know, some have taught that all religion, that this statement of Peter means that all religions that separate people are acceptable to God. You know, there's many roads to God, many roads to the mountain. It's not necessary to be saved to be acceptable to God, because God is so loving, he's not going to reject anyone. There's no problem with anyone who's sincere about their religion, whatever it is. God's going to accept them if they're doing righteousness. You know, Peter's upbringing included memorizing Psalms. And he was very familiar with Psalm 15. And it looks at what God considers an acceptable religion, Psalm 15. It describes what verse 35 means when it says righteousness. It's all about behavior, this thing. And here's what it says. Who can dwell in your tent, talking to God, who can dwell in your tent or live on your holy mountain? The one who lives honestly. He practices righteousness, acknowledging the truth in his heart. Acknowledging truth. Doesn't slander with his tongue. Doesn't harm his friend or discredit his neighbor. Such a person despises the one rejected by the Lord, but honors those who fear the Lord. He keeps his word, whatever the cost to him. Doesn't lend his money at interest, never takes a bribe against the innocent. The one who does these things will never be moved. That's what a righteous person is like. And the centurion knew that his former pagan religion was not like that. He knew the multiple gods of paganism were not gods, and even if they were, their behavior was reprehensible. And their attitude towards humans was callous. They were not righteous, if they were even existing. He knew the Greek and Roman religion was not acceptable to God. And any other religion that denies all these things that are righteousness can't possibly be acceptable to God. So, the centurion had become a Jewish God-fearer. He knew that the God of the Jews is the only God there is. He did what he could to be righteous before God, obeying these things he read in scriptures. Because he reverenced the God of Israel. He tried to be like Psalm 15. So our story has already described him in verse 2 of this chapter. He was a devout man and feared God along with his whole household. He did many charitable deeds for the Jewish people and always prayed to God. The angel who visited him told him, "Your prayers and your acts of charity have come up as a memorial offering before God." So if Judaism was acceptable to God, and if the centurion was righteous in the eyes of Judaism, why wasn't that enough? Why did the angel tell him that there was a message he needed to hear from Peter? If he had been righteous enough already. Why did he need to send for Peter? Peter's audience, they were all obeying all the things that defined living righteously. Yet apparently it wasn't enough. So, what do they need to hear? God wanted to reveal a truth beyond righteous behavior. Not instead of righteous behavior. Beyond righteous behavior. And Peter saw that now. He saw what they needed to hear. They didn't know about Jesus. So that's what he proceeds to tell them. And the first church of Caesarea gains its first Gentile members. The first time that has happened in the history of the universe. Whew. You know, when we go through our days, once in a while God reveals to us that we're actually in a meeting that he has arranged. You're in a divine appointment. Did you ever have that experience? Sitting there talking to somebody going, "Oh, there's something more going on here." I've had that happen. When he does that, he has a helpful message that he wants you to speak into their lives. That'll be a blessing to them. Don't know what it is. Every situation's different, right? It might be the message that Jesus saves, like Peter was going to tell them. You know, if we refuse, I've heard sermons where if you refuse, that person's going to go to hell and you're going to be in the cause of it. And no, God's not like that. If you refuse, God's going to find somebody else to bring this message to the person, but you are going to miss the blessing that he had intended to give you. Who knows but whether the message from God is what the person has been waiting to hear their whole lives. That will just transform them and give them peace in their hearts that's been lacking all this time. We have the authority to do that. You will have brought the favor of God upon that person and instituted them into eternal life. Living forever, this stuff is real. So like Peter, let's listen to what people are saying to us. What are they saying to me? Let's also, during these conversations, let's listen to see what maybe God is saying in this conversation. Listen for him. That's what in our praising God part of the sermons, I'm always asking us, where have you seen God at work? I want us to become sensitive for sensing him. And in this conversation is one of them. to sense that he is doing something here. This isn't a normal conversation. God is at work here. Listen for him. And then be ready to speak when you're told something like the centurion told Peter, we are present before God to listen to everything God has commanded you to say. And then go ahead and say it. Amen.